Most older men don't fear dating again, they fear becoming the version of themselves they had to be the last time they tried. Daniel Brooks sits alone at his kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him, the kind of quiet that used to feel empty now settling in like something earned, something protected, and then his phone lights up, a simple message, an invitation, nothing dramatic, nothing complicated, just the possibility of starting something new, and for a moment he stares at it, not confused, not excited, but paused, like a man standing at the edge of a place he's already been before, and what most people would see in that hesitation is fear, maybe even bitterness. They'd say he's closed off, that he's given up, that somewhere along the way he stopped believing in connection, but that's not what's happening here, not even close, because what looks like avoidance on the surface is often something much quieter and much more deliberate underneath. It's memory, it's pattern recognition, it's the weight of knowing exactly what something costs before you agree to pay for it again. And men like Daniel didn't arrive at this moment overnight. They didn't wake up one day and decide they were done with love. They got here slowly, through years of showing up, through years of trying, through years of believing that if you just gave enough, stayed patient enough, understood enough, things would eventually work out. And somewhere along that path, something shifted, not in their ability to feel, but in their willingness to ignore what those feelings had already taught them, because at this stage of life, it's not the idea of dating that makes a man pause like this, it's the quiet realization that peace, once found, is not something you casually risk again. When Daniel was 28, a message like that would have meant possibility, it would have carried a quiet excitement, a sense that something new might begin if he just showed up and gave it a chance, because back then, he believed effort created outcomes. He believed patience turned into loyalty, and he believed that if something did not work, it was simply because he had not tried hard enough yet, and so he kept trying, he kept showing up, he kept investing time, energy, attention, and pieces of himself without ever stopping to ask what it was costing him in return. But now at 63, sitting in the same kitchen with the same kind of message glowing on his phone, the meaning has completely changed, not because he stopped valuing connection, but because he finally understands something that younger men cannot fully see yet, that not every beginning leads somewhere worth going. And more importantly, not every connection deserves access to your time, your energy, or your peace, because time no longer feels endless, it feels measured, it feels real, it feels like something you can actually run out of, and once that shift happens, everything about how you approach relationships changes. You stop asking can this work, and you start asking is this worth it, and those are two very different questions, because one is driven by hope, and the other is driven by clarity. And clarity does not rush, it does not chase, it observes. It waits, it remembers, and what Daniel remembers is not just the good moments that once made everything feel worth it, but the long stretches in between, the misunderstandings, the quiet disappointments, the subtle ways a man can slowly lose pieces of himself while still technically being in something called a relationship, and that memory, more than anything else, is what makes his hands stay still instead of reaching for that phone. He does not fear the first conversation. He does not fear sitting across from someone new at a quiet restaurant or hearing a different story unfold. What he fears is everything that comes after that, the part no one talks about, the slow repetition of explaining who he is, what he values, why he thinks the way he does, over and over again, as if the past 60 years of his life have to be translated into something digestible for someone who has not lived it with him, and that process, more than anything, feels exhausting in a way it never used to, because it is not just words, it is emotional reopening, it is letting someone step into spaces that took years to rebuild, and Daniel knows exactly what that requires. He knows it means lowering his guard just enough to be understood, but not so much that he loses himself again, and that balance is not easy to maintain, especially when experience has already shown him how quickly things can shift, how interest can fade, how effort can become one-sided without warning. And it is not that he believes every situation will end that way, it is that he understands it can, and that awareness changes everything, because now every new beginning carries a quiet question underneath it, not spoken, not even fully formed, but always present: how much of myself will this cost if it goes wrong? And that question does not come from fear, it comes from memory, from moments where he stayed longer than he should have, gave more than he had, and convinced himself that it would eventually balance out, and it rarely did, and once a man sees that pattern clearly, once he feels it deeply enough, he does not rush back into situations that require him to risk repeating it, not because he has given up, but because he has finally learned to protect something he once gave away too easily. What Daniel has now is something he did not even realize he was missing for most of his life, and that is a sense of quiet that does not need to be filled, a kind of peace that is not dependent on anyone else showing up or staying or understanding him perfectly. It is built into the rhythm of his days, the way the house sounds in the morning, the way time moves without pressure, the way his thoughts are no longer interrupted by the constant need to adjust himself to fit someone else's expectations. And at first, years ago, that silence felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like something was missing, like he should be doing more, reaching out more, trying again. But over time, that feeling changed. It settled into something steady, something reliable, something he could return to without effort. And that is when everything shifted, because once a man experiences that level of internal calm, once he realizes that his life can feel full without constant emotional negotiation, he begins to see things differently. He starts to notice how easily that peace can be disrupted, not always by dramatic conflict, but by small, repeated tensions, the need to explain himself, the subtle pressure to compromise on things that once felt non-negotiable, the quiet erosion of routines that took years to build. And none of these things seem significant in isolation, but together they add up, they change the texture of his life. And Daniel knows this not as a theory, but as something he has already lived through, which is why now, when he looks at that phone, it is not just a message he sees, it is a decision, a doorway, a possible shift away from the stability he worked so hard to create. And that is what gives him pause, not because connection is unimportant, but because peace, once earned, becomes something a man learns to protect with intention. Elaine Parker was not a bad person, not cruel, not intentionally destructive, and that is what made it harder for Daniel to recognize what was happening while he was still inside it, because nothing about that relationship looked obviously wrong from the outside. There were no dramatic endings, no clear breaking point, just a slow and almost invisible shift over time, where small things began to accumulate, moments where he chose silence instead of honesty because it felt easier. Moments where he adjusted his tone, his words, even his reactions just to keep the peace, and at first those adjustments seemed harmless, even necessary, part of what it meant to make something work. But over months and then years, those small compromises started to stack in ways he did not fully notice until much later, until one day he realized he was no longer responding as himself, he was responding as the version of himself that kept everything stable, that avoided tension, that carried more than he should have without saying it out loud. And that realization did not come all at once, it came quietly, in moments when he was alone, moments when he felt a kind of exhaustion he could not explain, not physical, but something deeper, something tied to constantly managing how much of himself he could actually show. And Elaine never asked him to become that version directly, but the dynamic between them made it feel necessary. And that is the part most people misunderstand, because the damage in a relationship does not always come from what is said, it often comes from what is slowly stopped from being said. And by the time Daniel stepped away, it was not anger he felt, it was clarity, the kind that arrives too late to fix what already happened but just in time to make sure it does not happen again. And that memory does not make him bitter, it makes him precise about what he is willing to risk losing if he ever opens that door again. At this stage of his life, Daniel does not experience time the way he used to. It no longer stretches endlessly ahead like something he can afford to spend without thinking. It feels measured now, almost tangible, like something that quietly moves forward whether he is careful with it or not. And that awareness changes the weight of every decision he makes, especially when it comes to who he allows into his life, because he understands something most people only realize much later, that a year spent in the wrong dynamic does not just pass, it takes something with it, energy, focus, emotional stability, and sometimes even a man's sense of who he is. And at 30, that loss feels temporary, recoverable, something you can rebuild without much consequence. But at 63, the math is different. The margin for error is smaller, the cost of starting over is heavier. And the recovery time is longer, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And Daniel knows this not from theory, but from experience, from years where he told himself to be patient, to give it more time, to see if things would improve, and sometimes they did not. And the realization that stays with him now is not regret, it is clarity. The kind that forces a different question before any new beginning is even considered, not will this make me happy, but will this disrupt the life I have already worked so hard to stabilize, because stability at this stage is not accidental, it is built, piece by piece, through choices that protected his time, his energy, and his peace, and once a man sees how much it took to create that, he does not casually risk losing it for something uncertain. No matter how promising it might appear on the surface, what most people miss is that Daniel is no longer looking at relationships as something that defines him, he is no longer measuring his value by whether someone chooses him, stays with him, or needs him, and that shift is subtle but it changes everything, because when a man stops needing validation from outside of himself, his tolerance for imbalance drops almost instantly, he no longer negotiates with things that feel off, he no longer explains away behaviors that drain him, and he no longer stays just to prove that he can make something work, because he already knows he can, he has done it before, and that is exactly why he is more careful now, not less, because experience has shown him that the ability to endure is not the same as the wisdom to walk away, and at this point in his life, he values the second far more than the first. And this is where many people misunderstand men like him, they assume his distance means disinterest, they assume his calm means he is emotionally unavailable, but what they are actually seeing is selectivity, a level of discernment that only comes after years of getting it wrong, years of learning that attraction is not enough, effort is not enough, and even history is not enough if the dynamic itself is not aligned, and Daniel does not need to rush into anything to prove otherwise, because he already knows who he is without anyone standing next to him, and that knowledge removes the urgency that once drove his decisions, leaving behind something quieter, something steadier, something that does not chase connection, but evaluates it, and if it does not meet a certain standard, he is completely at peace letting it pass without ever reaching for it. This is the part that rarely gets said out loud, the part that makes everything finally make sense. Because what looks like hesitation is often a form of protection that took decades to learn. Daniel is not standing still because he is unsure, he is standing still because he sees clearly, he understands that connection is not automatically a positive force, that the wrong connection can quietly take more than it gives without ever announcing itself as a problem, and that awareness changes the entire equation, because now the absence of a relationship does not feel like something missing, it feels like something preserved, something intact, something that has not been disrupted, and that is a very different emotional position than most people expect, because society teaches that being alone is a problem to solve, something temporary, something that should be fixed as quickly as possible, but Daniel no longer sees it that way, he sees that being alone can also mean being undisturbed, being clear, being fully present in his own life without the constant negotiation that comes with the wrong dynamic, and once a man experiences that kind of stability, he does not rush to replace it with uncertainty, no matter how appealing the idea of connection might seem on the surface, and this is where many people misinterpret men like him, they think he is closing himself off, when in reality he is filtering more carefully than ever before, because he knows that not all loneliness is painful, and not all companionship is peaceful, and once that distinction becomes real, once it is felt instead of just understood, the choices a man makes begin to look very different from the outside, but from his perspective, they have never made more sense. Daniel does not reach for the phone, not because he is incapable of feeling something, but because he finally understands what that feeling can lead to if it is not grounded in something real, something steady, something that does not require him to slowly give up pieces of himself just to keep it alive, and that is the part most people never see. They only see the surface decision, the unanswered message, the quiet distance, and they label it as fear, but what is actually happening is far more intentional than that. It is a man choosing not to return to a version of life that once cost him more than he was willing to admit at the time, and now that he can see it clearly, he cannot unsee it. He cannot pretend that starting over is just a simple step forward, because he knows it is not just about starting, it is about what follows, what is required, what is gradually asked of him in ways that are easy to ignore until they are no longer small, and this is where everything shifts into something deeper, something that goes beyond dating, beyond relationships, into a decision about how he wants to live the rest of his life, because at this stage, a man like Daniel is no longer chasing experiences to feel complete. He is protecting the life he has already built, the clarity he fought to gain, the peace he learned to recognize, and that choice, from the outside, can look like hesitation, but from the inside, it feels like alignment, it feels like finally living in a way that does not require constant adjustment, constant compromise, constant negotiation, and that is why he lets the phone sit there a little longer, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for everything it took to become the man who no longer needs to answer right away.